Hey y'all, welcome back everyone to part two of Edgefield Pottery. We are continuing with our series Crafting in the Crucible, Black Artisans in the Antebellum South. And today we're going to be continuing on the Edgefield ceramics, we're going to be reviewing the incredible work of Dave Drake, and also other unknown enslaved ceramicists. We'll also be taking a look at these incredible face vessels and just about one particular family post-Civil War that continue with ceramics. I do want to provide some context of the conditions that enslaved Africans and African Americans were facing in South Carolina. So in 1739, South Carolina, there was the Stono Rebellion. So if we could back it up to 1693, the King of Spain, Charles II, had given a proclamation that any enslaved person that made their way to Florida, which was a Spanish colony, as long as they converted to Catholicism and fought for the crown or swore to the crown, they would be granted freedom. In 1738, that decree was expanded to provide sanctuary specifically in Fort Moses, and that was the first sanction-free community in St. Augustine, Florida. However, on September 9th, around 1739, about 20 enslaved Africans, many from the Kingdom of the Congo, hold on to that for the Congo because this is really important for later. They broke into the storehouse, took guns, rifles, ammunition. They also decapitated the two shopkeepers that were there, and they placed their heads on the front steps to serve as warning. These men strategically marched and attacked specific plantation, killing white folks in their path. Eventually, the enslaved number of African and African Americans grows to about 100 people. Eventually, they were caught. Many were executed during the standoffs. Some were executed at a later date, but many of them also were sent back to the West Indies. So in 1740, South Carolina passed the Negro Act in response to the 1739 Stoner Rebellion. This Negro Act prohibited enslaved Black folks to travel alone or in groups of assembly. It also had selling their own groups. So essentially, no community or mobility, no communication. So no drums, horns, indigenous instruments, no education. It was illegal for them to learn to read and write, as well as for individuals to teach them to read and write. And then lastly, economic independence. So they couldn't sell their own food as well. And in justice, they were denied their right to a trial and also to testify under oath. This is at this point was rendering folks to a point of they just didn't have the ability to do anything, really truly enslaving them in bondage to of their personhoods. So let's talk about David Drake. David Drake, also known as Dave or Dave the Potter, is an expert potter, ceramicist, artist, as well as poet. He revolutionized ceramics, but more importantly, he challenged every stereotype that has been constructed around Black people at that time. His pottery not only reflected his artistic capabilities, but again, it was a form of his resistance. David Drake was born in 1800s in the South Carolina. He was originally owned by the Landrum family, and was enslaved by multiple families, all of them owning industrial pottery plantations, and all of them having some relation or connection to Dr. Abner Landrum. But what made Dave even more revolutionary was the size of his pieces. We do also know that he was a disabled enslaved person. One of his legs was amputated. We do not know if this was a punishment for an attempt to escape. However, many historians have cited that it was a real accident that had happened at some point in his life. But going back to his pottery, it would be the fact that he made these pots that were 30, 40 gallons big by hand on a wheel, but more importantly, that he was literate. His literacy would be made his work not only revolutionary, but a form of resistance. But how do we see this revolutionary or resistor? In order to understand how this happens, we get to understand Drake's owners and plantations. So Harvey Drake, who is Dr. Abner Landrum's nephew, remember Dr. Abner Landrum is responsible for Pottersville and the whole alkaline process of these ceramics. Um, he was the original owner. So again, Dave was born into slavery. Also that, with that, he was in business with his own uncle. We also believe that Dr. Abner Landrum may have been the one to taught him how to read and write. Dr. Landrum was extremely religious and more than likely wanted his enslaved persons to know the word of God. Dr. Abner never owned David, but beginning around 1818, there was a mortgage of David Drake between Harvey Drake and Dr. Abner Landrum. Next, we have Reuben Drake, which was Harvey's brother, who had him just for a short period of time. Then he transferred to Reverend John Landrum, so Dr. Abner Landrum's brother, from 1835 to 1846. And again, that religious factor as well. And then lastly, second to last, excuse me, Franklin Landrum, which was Reverend John Landrum's son, had him. That is where Drake experienced the most cruelty. Franklin Landrum was a horrific, horrific human in how his enslaved were even more brutalized. And then lastly, Lewis Miles would purchase him in 1849. And there is a difference whether he was let free at the end of the war or 1861 or somewhere in between there. Now, here are just a couple facts as we move on to look at Drake's work. Dave Drake scholar Jill Boat Coverman argues that in his lifetime, Drake created an estimate of 40,000 ceramics. About 70 of those vessels have some signia of David Drake, either a poem, a signature, or the date in his handwriting. And again, he's creating these massive vessels. And you can also identify Drake's work because the mouth of his works, so the mouths of the pots and vessels, are so wide. So Drake signed his work. In addition to signing his work, Drake would often scribe poems or prose on his work. It is due to his signature that we're able to identify so many of his pieces. This was created at Lewis Miles Stony Bluff Pottery Manufacturing, i.e. Red Plantation. This jug is more than likely used to store fluid, possibly drinking, such as wine or alcohol. But with this gorgeous bronze glaze beneath the handle, we do see the date of June 28th, 1854, with his name, Dave. On the side directly beneath the spout of the vessel is the quote, LM says this handle will crack. LM more than likely refers to Drake's enslaver at the time of Lewis Miles. One wonders if Drake was making the statement that this handle will crack as if this bondage or this institution or slavery will crack, or if it's just Lewis telling him that, I don't think this is going to hold up and be viable ceramic. And here's another example of Drake's work where we see these large gallon ceramic vessel, probably used to storage food or maybe more liquid like water or such. We also see that around the lip of the mouth is an inscription along with his name. This jar, again, is another example, not only of that olive alkaline glaze, but another one of Drake's signature. Above Drake's signature, it says LM May 3rd, 1862. Again, LM, the initials for Lewis Miles, his current owner, and the date for which he signed the vessel. And on the other side of this vessel is one of Drake's proses. Now, keep in mind that on these vessels, they will have the initial of the owner of the ceramic plantation, even if they've never touched a single pot or had any active hand in the process of it. But again, on the other side of this vessel is one of Drake's prose. I made this jar olive cross. If you don't repent, you will be lost. And according to the National Museum of American History, this is an example of Drake's importance and understanding of religion. Additionally, it is suggested that it may be related to Acts 2, verses 14 through 42. And this is when Peter is speaking to the crowd at the temple of Herod. This is just an image from the Museum of Fine Art installation of the exhibition Hear Me Now, the Black Potters of Old Edgefield in South Carolina from 2023. I just wanted to show you the scale and magnitude and size of these varieties of the vessels that Drake had created. But now we're going to move on to look at some unknown ceramicists of Edgefield. So here we have an example of a water cooler from Phoenix Stoneware Factory. And this industrial plantation was owned by Colin Rhodes and Robert Mathis. If you recall, Phoenix Stoneware was known for the glazes and decorative work on their pottery. In this, we can see an image of a Black woman and a Black man dressed, not how you would imagine some enslaved individuals would be. At the end of the pot, or the lower part, we do see a hog facing on the vessel. Although we do not know the story behind the imagery, many have interpreted as if this is a wedding, because if you look at the detail of the man and woman, they're dressed for a cut. Certainly, he has his top hat off. She has ruffles around the collar, but we do see like two wine glasses as if they're toasting. Additionally, we see the hog, who by anatomy suggestion has possibly been nursing as she is, again, next to a similar water cooler. Some historians have argued that maybe there's a context, but maybe it's just a rather example of showing how the skill of the enslaved artist in decorative works. The next piece was created for a plantation owner by the name of Joel Ridgel. Again, this comes from the factory of Colin Rhodes. The other side has an image of another woman dressed in a very fancy dress of that time, and she's also wearing gloves. The work is supposedly of his two ex-wives. However, with the figures being painted black, one wonders if this is the intention of the creator, if these were actually the mistresses of Mr. Ridgel, or if this is just the available materials they had at the time. Another example of a jug. So keep in mind these ceramics and stoneware were utilitarian objects, simplistic in design of the vessel with the mouth and handle. And this jug was actually created on the Miles Mills ceramic plantation. So, in addition to the works created for the industrial plantation, Black folks made their own as well, specifically the face vessels. So the vase vessel is an art form that is created by enslaved Africans and African Americans in the United States on U.S. soil. Although we do not know how many were created between the Edgefield, South Carolina ceramic era up until turn of the century, we do have about roughly 180 that are still existing. These face vessels' purpose are often attributed to spiritual or religious practices brought from the coast of West Africa. More importantly, they are a through line to home. An example of ancestral memory that we will often see are from the Congo Kingdom. And these are just example of the vessels that come from that as well. And we're going to see them even more. So this is the Nisi Nkandi. They are spiritually charged figures that are used by the spiritualists called Nganga. These figures hold the supernatural energies and powers used in the communities to help heal the sick, medicinal purposes, spiritual cleanses, care for the community, and settle disputes. These figures are packed with medicinal ingredients, also known as bilango, in these wooden carved figures. They are filled in cavities of the abdomen and the head. Now, in order for these figures to be charged, the inganga and individuals that need assistance drive nails of iron would be driven into the figure as a pact or an agreement. Each nail is an agreement between the spiritual entity and that person. So again, in these two, we have in this image, we have two images. We have on the left an Akisi figure, and on the right a face vessel. And the materials are very similar. The kaolin, remember that is that porcelain white that Dr. Abner Lander originally wanted to do for his ceramics. This is what makes the eyes, the teeth, and the mouth with that. And so again, the same materials that were found in West Africa were also found specifically in the Edgefield region of South Carolina. These face jugs or face vessels come in a variety of sizes, but what were these vessels used for? These vessels had many functions in the community. In addition to being utilitarian object for water and food, some of them were used to commemorate those who have passed. They were also used in spiritual ceremonies. One of the most frequent uses that they were placed on resting places of ancestors. Some of the vessels were also used to ward off bad spirit. Now, this is just two examples of burial practice of now ancestors. On the left is a sketch of a burial from the Congo in the early 1830s. And the one on the left is one from South Carolina. So there's a perimeter of objects, a combination of nature and man-made objects, encompass the deceased resting place, and may be accompanied by objects that the deceased once possessed or owned. So broken pots or vessels are also placed on the burial sites to allow the ancestors to move between the physical and spiritual realm. So Black ceramicists and Reconstruction postbellum. era changed the course of U.S. with the implementation of President Lincoln's executive order of Emancipation Proclamation going into effect on January 1st, 1863, and the end of the Civil War on April 9th, 1865. Enslaved Black folks um, were now free to leave and move around. And from 1867 to roughly 1877 is considered the governmental and radical Reconstruction, with the creation of such amendments of the 13th, 14th, and 15th, with Union soldiers enforcing this legislation. Now, with Black folk being liberated, many industrial slave businesses ceased to exist, and the ceramic industrial slave manufacturing plantations in Edgefield, South Carolina, were no different. Many Black people remained in the area, attempting to start their own farms and build their own economy and livelihood. However, it was the enfranchised Black Americans that enraged the former Confederates that would lead them to vigilante white supremacist mentality and form anti Black groups. One particular group was the Red Shirts. They were founded and formed by Confederate General Martin Gray, where they used voter suppression and intimidation and polls and strategic violence. Now, why does that sound familiar in 2026? But in July 1876, the Hamburg massacre occurred. This was a series of armed white Confederate Democrats showing up to predominantly Black Edgefield districts, threatening the community. Over the course of days, over 100 Black men were killed by red shirts, including 30 Black men that were in the National Guard. By 1881, there ends up being this mass exodus of Black folks from Edgefield. Now, some of those made their way, could bring in the skills that they had. So let's talk about the H. Wilson and Pottery Company. These were three formerly enslaved brothers that learned the art from their enslaver, John M. Wilson Jr., and they also created their own H. Wilson Pottery Company. They were the first African American business that opened in the state of Texas. Business opened in 1869. Land was given to them by 1872. It was an opportunity to hire African Americans instead of them becoming sharecroppers post Emancipation Proclamation. And here are just some examples of this beautiful stoneware, as again, we're still seeing the alkaline glaze stoneware that is well known from Edgefield as well. Now, we're going to summarize all of this. So, although the Slave Act of 1740 prohibited basic human rights to enslave Africans and African Americans, David Drake was literate and very well versed in prose. His resistance is in every vessel he created when he signed his name. Resistance also came in the form of creativity of these vessels, as the figures and characters were painted Black to represent and reflect Black presence at the time. Ancestral memory crossed the Atlantic in the form of face vessels similar to the Nkisi and Kondo figures of the Congo, and they were used as objects of remembrance of ancestors, medicinal practices, and spiritual healing. And although Reconstruction did not live up to the expectations, former enslaved ceramicists went on to build their own business in the ceramic world outside of Edgefield. And that concludes our Edgefield, South Carolina, and ceramics in the antebellum South. Please stay tuned, because next up we're going to be looking at blacksmiths and ironwork. Take care, y'all. Peace.